The church windows shattered as the Molotov cocktail exploded against the sanctuary wall. Inside, 73-year-old Sister Mary Washington never stopped playing the piano. Her weathered fingers moved across the keys like lightning, each note a defiant prayer rising through the smoke and chaos. The year was 1963. Birmingham, Alabama burned with the fever of change. But in the basement of Mount Zion Baptist Church, something more powerful than hatred was brewing. Something that would shake the foundations of America itself. The FBI had infiltrated their meetings. The Klan had marked their building. Death threats arrived daily like poisoned letters, yet every Sunday, every Wednesday, every moment when hope seemed lost, they gathered, they sang, they resisted. What they didn't know was that their voices, these forgotten voices from forgotten streets, would become the soundtrack of freedom. Their songs would travel from cotton fields to the White House, from chain gangs to Carnegie Hall. Tonight, as flames licked at their sacred walls, they were about to discover that music isn't just sound. It's revolution wrapped in melody. It's the weapon that never fails. This isn't just another story about music. This is the untold saga of how the Black Church became America's greatest recording studio. Not for fame or fortune, but for freedom itself. For over 4 centuries, these sacred spaces have been laboratories of liberation, where enslaved voices learned to soar beyond their chains. From the Underground Railroad's coded spirituals to the civil rights movement's marching anthems, gospel music has been the heartbeat of every fight for justice in American history. When laws failed, when politics betrayed, when hope seemed impossible, there was always the song, always the voice crying out in the wilderness, demanding to be heard. But here's what most people do not understand. This music didn't just comfort the oppressed, it terrified the oppressor. Southern lawmakers banned certain spirituals. Plantation owners forbade gatherings where these songs were sung because they recognized something deadly in those harmonies, the sound of people who refused to stay broken. Today, as our world faces new forms of division and injustice, these songs matter more than ever. They remind us that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hums, sometimes it changes everything with nothing but a melody and the courage to sing it. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this and tell me in the comments which country and city you're watching from. The ship's hull groaned against the Atlantic waves, but it couldn't drown out the sound. 73 stolen souls, chained in darkness, had found something their captors never expected. They had found their voice. Aduni pressed her lips together, letting the ancient Yoruba melody flow through her teeth like a whispered prayer. The white men above didn't understand the words, but they felt the power. Something in those foreign syllables made them nervous. Within hours, other voices joined hers. Mandinka warriors hummed war chants. Akan mothers sang lullabies that doubled as maps home. What had begun as individual grief was becoming collective strength. The ship's captain, Samuel Morrison, paced the deck above. He'd transported human cargo for 12 years, but he'd never heard anything like this. These weren't the usual cries of despair. This was something else, something organized. But what happened next would change the course of American music forever. When the ship docked in Charleston, those songs didn't die. They went underground. In cotton fields, enslaved people learned that certain melodies could coordinate work rhythms. Others could signal danger. Some could even map escape routes. The plantation owners noticed. They tried to silence the singing, but you can't kill what lives in the heart. The music simply evolved. It became more subtle, more coded, more dangerous. By the 1700s, these musical messages had spread through every slave state. A spiritual about crossing Jordan really meant crossing the Ohio River to freedom. A song about Moses wasn't just Bible study, it was revolution disguised as worship. The white churches, with their formal hymns and rigid structures, never suspected While they sang about heaven someday, the black churches were singing their people toward freedom today. Every Sunday was a strategy session. Every hymn was a battle plan. It was at this moment that America's greatest cultural export was born, not in a recording studio, but in the crucible of human suffering transformed into hope. The irony was profound. Those who had stolen voices from Africa had inadvertently created the greatest musical force in American history. They had planted seeds they could never control, seeds that would grow into something far more powerful than they ever imagined. Harriet Tubman stood at the edge of the Maryland woods, her voice barely above a whisper. But to the 19 souls crouched behind her, that whisper might as well have been thunder. She was singing "Wade in the Water," and everyone knew what it meant. The song wasn't random, it was GPS for the enslaved. Wade in the water meant travel by creek beds to throw off the dogs. God's gonna trouble the water was code for conductors like Harriet, disturbing the usual routes when danger approached. Young Samuel, only 14, and making his first run toward freedom, had memorized every verse. His grandmother had taught him that these spirituals were libraries, storing escape routes, safe houses, and warnings in musical form. Knowledge that could mean the difference between freedom and death. The plantation owner's worst nightmare was unfolding in plain sight. Every church service, every work song, every lullaby was potentially a resistance meeting. The enslaved had weaponized music itself. But what the slaveholders didn't realize was that their attempts to control these songs would backfire in the most spectacular way. In response to growing musical resistance, some states passed laws forbidding enslaved people from singing certain spirituals. Louisiana banned "Go Down, Moses." Georgia prohibited gatherings where "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" was sung. Virginia made it illegal for more than 3 enslaved people to sing together without white supervision. But you can't legislate away what lives in the human soul. The songs simply went deeper underground. They became more sophisticated, more coded, more effective. Church basements became conservatories of resistance. Children learned not just to sing, but to sing strategically. Every congregation became a choir of potential freedom fighters, their voices carefully trained for the day when they might need to sing their way to liberation. The Underground Railroad's greatest conductors were also its greatest musicians. Harriet Tubman's expeditions were legendary not just for their success rate, but for their musicality. She could communicate complex escape plans through a single spiritual coordinate movements across miles with nothing but a melody. It was during these decades that gospel music proved it wasn't just entertainment, it was warfare by other means. By 1860, the musical underground had become so sophisticated that slaveholders were genuinely frightened. They recognized that every black church service was potentially a strategic planning session, every spiritual potentially a call to arms. They were right to be afraid. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed, but freedom felt fragile as morning mist. In churches across the South, newly freed people gathered to sing the songs that had carried them through bondage. But now those songs needed new meanings, new purposes, new power. Reverend Charles Tindley stood behind the pulpit of East Calvary Methodist Church in Philadelphia, watching his congregation's faces. These were people who had tasted freedom but found it bitter with new struggles. Jim Crow laws, economic exploitation, violence that never ended. He opened his mouth and sang words that would become legendary. "We shall overcome." The melody was ancient, born in the slavery era, but the words were pure prophecy. Every voice in that sanctuary joined him, and something electric happened. The song didn't just fill the church, it filled the neighborhood. Windows opened, people stopped on sidewalks, children put down their games to listen. This wasn't just music, this was a declaration of war against despair itself. But what happened next would transform American culture in ways no one could predict. Word of Tindley's songs spread like wildfire through the black church network. Congregations from Atlanta to Chicago began singing his compositions. "Stand by me," "Leave it there," "I'll overcome someday." Each song became a standard in what was quietly becoming America's most influential musical movement. The Fisk Jubilee singers took these spirituals from church basements to concert halls. Their 1871 tour raised money for their university, but more importantly, it proved that black sacred music could command respect on the world's greatest stages. They performed for presidents and queens, showing that what began in slave quarters was worthy of palaces. But the most significant development happened in small churches across the rural South. Musicians like Thomas Dorsey began experimenting with blues rhythms in sacred contexts. The result was scandalous, revolutionary, and irresistible: the birth of modern gospel music. Traditional church leaders were horrified. How could sacred music incorporate the devil's music? But congregations knew better. They recognized that joy and sorrow, sacred and secular, hope and heartbreak, were all part of the human experience. The music needed to reflect that complexity. It was at this moment that gospel music became something unprecedented, a genre that could make you weep and dance simultaneously. By 1920, black churches had created something the world had never seen: a musical form that was simultaneously ancient and modern, sacred and revolutionary, comforting and challenging. They had taken the raw materials of their suffering and forged them into pure cultural gold. The recording engineer had never heard anything like it. Behind the primitive microphone stood Mahalia Jackson, all of 19 years old, her voice about to shatter every assumption about what sacred music could be. The year was 1937, and America was about to meet its new queen of gospel. Her voice didn't just carry notes, it carried centuries of prayer, pain, and power. When she sang, "God's gonna separate the wheat from the tares," grown men wept. Church mothers shouted. The very air in the studio seemed to tremble with something beyond music. But Mahalia wasn't alone. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was electrifying audiences with her guitar-driven spirituals. Clara Ward was revolutionizing gospel harmony with the Ward Singers. Marion Williams was hitting notes that seemed to pierce heaven itself. The golden age of gospel was blooming. These women weren't just entertainers. They were preachers without pulpits, theologians with microphones. Their concerts became revivals. Their recordings became sermons. Their voices became the sound of Black America's unshakable faith. But what the record labels didn't understand would change the music industry forever. White executives tried to market these artists to black audiences only, assuming their appeal was limited. They were catastrophically wrong. Mahalia Jackson's records sold to housewives in Iowa, factory workers in Detroit, and college students in California. Gospel music had become America's music. The irony was delicious. Music born from the most oppressed people in America was now influencing the most privileged. Elvis Presley openly credited black gospel as his primary influence. The Beatles studied gospel vocal arrangements. Bob Dylan called Mahalia Jackson one of the most powerful singers ever. Radio stations that had never played black music found themselves unable to ignore these voices. Gospel programs became some of the most popular shows on air. Sunday mornings belonged to the church, but the church's sound was filling every day of the week. The economic impact was staggering. Gospel music created an entire industry: record labels, radio stations, concert venues, music publishing companies. But more importantly, it created cultural influence, black voices impossible to ignore or marginalize. It was during this era that gospel music proved something revolutionary, that America needed black culture far more than it wanted to admit. By 1950, gospel music had become one of America's most successful cultural exports. European audiences lined up for hours to hear Mahalia Jackson. Japanese radio stations played Sister Rosetta Tharpe. The music that began in slave quarters was now conquering the world. The Montgomery buses sat empty, their diesel engines cooling in the Alabama heat. But from the Holt Street Baptist Church, voices rose like smoke from a sacred fire. They were singing, "We Shall Overcome," the same song Reverend Tindley had written decades earlier, now becoming the anthem of the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. understood something that politicians missed. Movements need music. The mind might debate, but the heart responds to melody. Every march needed its songs. Every protest needed its hymns. Every victory needed its celebration. Mahalia Jackson stood beside Dr. King at the March on Washington, her voice warming up the crowd before his famous speech. But she did more than perform. She interrupted him mid-speech, shouting, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Her voice, shaped by decades of gospel tradition, literally helped birth the most famous speech in American history. The Freedom Singers emerged from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee meetings, transforming traditional spirituals into protest anthems. "Keep your eyes on the prize" became their battle hymn. "This little light of mine" became their declaration of defiance. Old songs found new power. But what happened next revealed gospel music's most dangerous quality, its ability to transform fear into courage. In Birmingham jail cells, protesters sang spirituals to keep their spirits alive. In Selma, marchers sang their way across Edmund Pettus Bridge. In Memphis, sanitation workers sang "We Shall Overcome" while demanding dignity. Music became the movement's oxygen. The impact extended far beyond protests. Gospel-trained voices like Sam Cooke, Aretha Franklin, and Ray Charles were revolutionizing popular music. They brought church vocal techniques to secular songs, creating soul music, gospel's rebellious child. Television cameras captured it all. White America, watching from their living rooms, couldn't ignore the power of these voices. The same spirituals their ancestors had tried to suppress were now soundtrack to their evening news. The oppressed had become impossible to silence. Record companies scrambled to sign gospel-influenced artists. The music that record executives had once dismissed as race music was now driving the entire industry. Gospel techniques influenced everything from rock to country to jazz. It was at this moment that gospel music achieved something unprecedented. It became the sound of America's conscience. By 1970, the civil rights movement had achieved legislative victories that seemed impossible just decades earlier. But those who knew the power of music understood the truth. The movement succeeded because it had the best soundtrack in history. Gospel music didn't just accompany change. It created the emotional conditions that made change inevitable. The church organ wheezed its last breath as young Kirk Franklin plugged in his synthesizer. The year was 1992, and the stained glass windows of traditional gospel were about to be shattered by hip-hop beats, contemporary arrangements, and a generation that refused to choose between sacred and relevant. Old-timers shook their heads in dismay. This wasn't their grandmother's gospel music. Where were the Hammond organs, the traditional hymns, the proper church clothes? But the young people filling the pews didn't care about tradition. They cared about truth, and truth, they discovered, could wear sneakers. Franklin's "Why We Sing" became an instant classic, proving that gospel music could evolve without losing its soul. His concerts looked more like parties than church services, but the message remained powerfully spiritual. He had found a way to make ancient truths sound urgently modern. The Winans family dominated the airwaves with their smooth harmonies and contemporary sound. Bibi and CeCe Winans crossed over to mainstream success while maintaining their gospel roots. They proved that sacred music could compete with any genre on quality and commercial appeal. But what the music industry didn't expect was how this new generation would reshape the entire concept of worship. Contemporary gospel artists like Donnie McClurkin, Yolanda Adams, and Marvin Sapp began filling arenas typically reserved for pop stars. Their concerts became massive worship experiences, drawing people who had never set foot in traditional churches. The church was coming to them. The influence flowed both ways. Secular artists increasingly incorporated gospel elements into their music. Whitney Houston's "I Will Always Love You" was essentially a gospel performance in pop clothing. Lauryn Hill's "The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill" was gospel album disguised as hip-hop. The lines between sacred and secular blurred beautifully. Technology amplified everything. Gospel music videos played on MTV. Gospel radio stations multiplied across the country. The internet allowed small church choirs to reach global audiences. Music that once struggled for distribution was now everywhere. But the most significant development was generational. Young people who had grown up with contemporary gospel were becoming leaders themselves. They brought fresh perspectives to ancient traditions, proving that innovation and reverence could coexist. It was during these decades that gospel music proved its ultimate power, the ability to remain eternally relevant while staying eternally true. By 2000, gospel music had achieved something remarkable. It had become both deeply traditional and thoroughly modern, commercially successful and spiritually authentic, globally influential and intimately personal. The music born in slavery had become one of America's greatest cultural achievements. The live stream connected a small church in rural Mississippi to viewers in Tokyo, Lagos, and London. Pastor Williams, leading worship during the COVID-19 pandemic, watched the chat explode with hearts and hallelujah emojis as their congregation of 30 sang with a virtual congregation of thousands. Gospel music had found its newest stage, the entire world. Kanye West shocked everyone with Jesus Walks, bringing gospel themes to hip-hop in ways that made both church mothers and rap critics pay attention. His later Jesus is King album topped the Billboard charts, proving that explicitly Christian music could still dominate popular culture. The sacred-secular divide continued crumbling. Kirk Franklin remained a force, but new voices were emerging. Tasha Cobb's "Leonard's Break Every Chain" became a global anthem. Israel Houghton blended gospel with Latin rhythms. Kierra Sheard brought millennial energy to traditional themes. Each generation discovered new ways to sing the same eternal truths. Social media transformed everything. TikTok videos of church choirs went viral. Instagram worship sessions reached millions. YouTube allowed unknown artists to become international stars overnight. The gatekeepers were gone. The gates were wide open. But what happened next would prove gospel music's most important truth, that some things never change. During the George Floyd protests, demonstrators sang "We Shall Overcome" in streets across America. The same song that powered the civil rights movement found new relevance in a new generation's fight for justice. 60 years later, gospel music was still the sound of resistance. Churches closed by the pandemic discovered that their influence had actually expanded. Online services reached people who would never walk through physical doors. Worship leaders in living rooms led congregations in 20 countries. The church building might be empty, but the church itself had never been fuller. Contemporary artists like Jonathan McReynolds, Tori Kelly, and HER continued blending genres, proving that gospel music's influence extended far beyond traditional boundaries. Grammy categories expanded to recognize gospel's diversity. The music industry finally acknowledged what black churches had always known. This music was too powerful to contain. The streaming revolution made gospel music more accessible than ever. Playlists mixed traditional spirituals with contemporary worship. Algorithm recommendations introduced young listeners to Mahalia Jackson and Kirk Franklin simultaneously. Past and present existed in eternal conversation. It was at this moment that gospel music revealed its ultimate truth, that it had never been about the past. It had always been about the eternal now. Today, in churches around the world, voices still rise in songs born from America's darkest chapters. Children who have never known slavery still sing freedom songs. People who have never picked cotton still find strength in field hollers transformed into hymns. The music endures because the human need for hope endures. As our story closes, one truth rings clearer than any note ever sung. Music isn't just entertainment, it's survival technology for the human spirit. From those first voices in slave ship holds to today's viral worship videos, gospel music has proven something revolutionary about humanity itself. We are not broken by what breaks us. We are not silenced by what seeks to silence us. In our darkest moments, we discover our greatest power, the ability to transform pain into praise, suffering into song, despair into defiance. This is why gospel music matters beyond churches, beyond faith, beyond cultural boundaries. It represents humanity's refusal to surrender to hopelessness. Every voice that has ever risen in song, whether in cotton fields or concert halls, in protest marches or pandemic live streams, has added to an eternal chorus that declares, "We are still here, we are still singing, we are still believing that tomorrow can be better than today." The legacy of Black church gospel music isn't just musical, it's moral. It teaches us that the most oppressed voices often carry the most powerful truths, that creativity flourishes in the soil of struggle, that what begins in desperation can end in triumph. So the next time you hear a voice raised in song, whether it's a choir on Sunday morning or a protester in the street, whether it's Mahalia Jackson or a child humming in the back seat, remember this: you're not just hearing music. You're hearing the sound of the human spirit refusing to be defeated. You're hearing the sound of resistance. You're hearing the sound of hope made audible. And that song, that eternal, unstoppable song, will never, ever end. The music plays on, the voices rise, the story continues.